Welcome into the official. We are continuing our interview series as we give our, tape grinders a few weeks off to really get into the 2024 class that we will begin sometime in April. But in the meantime, I am bringing on some really interesting personalities and innovators in the recruiting space to talk about the landscape and some different approaches that some different companies and different evaluators have. So tonight we are very excited to have Cory Yates, founder and CEO of Real Analytics, um, a really innovative recruiting company, and I will let him fill all of us in on what they are doing, how they approach recruiting, and we'll hopefully get into some really good discussion. So without further ado, this is the official. All right, we are back. Cory Yates in the house, brand new guest. Never had him on the show before, but founder and CEO of Real Analytics, which is a company that honestly inspired a little bit of what we do here on the official. And without me going too much into it, I'd love to hear it straight from you, Cory. You want to just jump right in and give our listeners the elevator speech of what Real Analytics seeks to do?
Absolutely. So Real Analytics is an AI-powered sports technology company. And what we do is we analyze video to measure what we call in-game athleticism. So we're measuring everything from top end speed, acceleration, change of direction. And then we also have position-specific metrics that we track, again, exclusively through video. And so we curate all of that data. And then we have a proprietary score that we call our in-game score, our in-game athleticism score. And we use that IGA score to project players, either from high school to college or from college to the NFL. And that scale is a 100-point scale by which we evaluate players.
Okay, that is fantastic. So I think of you guys as a recruiting site, and I know you've changed names. Now you're Real Analytics, so maybe that is taking into account more of the different levels. So do you have some NFL clients, or you're trying to break into that college to NFL? Because I always thought of you as high school to college. Is that a
Correct.
new development a little bit?
We started in terms of targeting the collegiate market, and then we've been reached out to by a handful of NFL teams because they're highly interested in player tracking data for players that they are considering drafting or signing, right? As it relates to understanding what their raw functional abilities and athleticism looks like. So we're able to help NFL clients understand the background of some of the players that they're interested in so that they have data that looks very similar to what they're already ingesting today. So obviously, if you think about the NFL, they've got player tracking data provided by Next Gen Stats. And so having tracking data on both collegiate players as well as high school players, they see a tremendous amount of value in that because, again, it's something that they look at on a more regular basis, even than some of our NFL or collegiate clients, excuse me.
Sure. And what you guys can do with your technology, because in the NFL, I think they have chips kind of on the player, either in the uniform or the ball or some different things like that. But at the college level, I don't think they have that. So they do need that video technology, I would imagine, that you can provide.
Yeah, so Zebra technology is what's used at the NFL level, right?
Okay.
And so that's RFID technology, really good technology, extremely expensive. And because it's
I'm sure.
expensive, right? The college programs, even at the Power Five levels, they can't afford to outfit their stadiums with this technology. And so what colleges do is they will use GPS technology and they will use wearable devices that they put on their players so that they can understand things like max speed, distance, sprint distance, acceleration. But where we add value is that we're able to take it a step further and we can provide our clients with not only player tracking data for players on their team, we can also provide that data on their opponents as well. So
Right, because yeah, the college landscape is not nearly as regulated as the NFL, right? So you've got have and have nots in a much more greater scale. So say Alabama can afford some of that, but you know, whatever UAB may not be able to, I suppose.
yeah, well, see and you're right, you're absolutely right. And the bigger challenge is really anchored around the wearable devices. So
Mm.
if I'm UAB, I can outfit my entire team with GPS or wearable technology, and I can have player tracking data on my roster. But when I go and play somebody in conference, I'm not going to have access to their data. So it's
Right.
very
Okay.
different model than the NFL, right? So all 32 teams have access to Zebra's
Mm,
player tracking data, but at the collegiate level, not so much. So you only have access to your own data. And so we've been able to actually help programs with advanced scouting and helping them understand where they have matchup advantages, primarily on the perimeter.
okay.
Now
Okay.
they understand, okay, I'm going up against this particular cornerback. His max speed is X, right? My receiver, his max speed is, maybe 10% faster. We think we have a matchup advantage over there, right? So we're able to help our clients from an advanced scouting standpoint, providing them with player tracking data on opponents that they're facing week in and week out. So that's a really,
Okay.
really cool application that really started to get some traction in 2022.
Okay, and that brings me that start my wheels are starting to turn here. I would imagine now, the last 2 years or so it's really picked up, but obviously we live in a transfer portal era now. So scouting these other players, whereas before, oh, Memphis has this really good corner, whatever, we played them once last year. Now, maybe we want to go get that Memphis corner. So I'm sure providing some of that data because it's a little bit more of this free agency is another new use for all your information, even within college teams.
Absolutely. So the transfer portal is huge. And so obviously we can provide and track players in terms of their high school highlights and film, but we can also do the same thing with college tape to the extent we have access to it. But more importantly, from a transfer portal perspective, if a kid enters the portal, and let's say he's a small school prospect,
Hmm.
right? One of the ways that we've been able to add value to our clients is helping them understand what his ceiling was coming out of high school. So if I'm TCU, who's one of our clients, and I'm looking at a transfer portal prospect, he comes from a small school, be it a G5 school or even an FCS, right? They're going to pair our in-game athleticism data with production data that they may source from somewhere, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
they're certainly going to look at production to understand how productive that player was at whatever level he's coming from. 9 times out of 10, if they're looking at that player, he was probably highly productive, right? He may have been an
That's how his
FCS All
name gets out
American.
there. Yeah.
Exactly. He may be an FCS All American. He could be, an AAC All Conference player. And so they kind of have an idea that yes, this player is productive. He's had success at the level he's competed at, but there's always a question as to whether or not that's going to translate to a higher level. And
Hmm.
that's where we help fill in some of those gaps. And so athletically, right, that's where they're leaning into our in-game athleticism score to understand in our projection to understand, hey, coming out of high school, was he projected based on the IGA score to be a Power 5 player? And if he was, they feel more comfortable with moving forward with that particular prospect. A good example is TCU last year. They actually signed an inside backer by the name of Johnny Hodges. Now he was a transfer portal prospect from Navy, and so there were some questions as to whether or not he can actually play, in the Big 12 because that the Big 12 is perceived as a more competitive conference. And
Hmm.
so they liked his tape. He was very productive at the academy that he was at. But then they looked at our IGA score and our projection of him when he was coming out of high school. We projected him to be a Power 5 player coming out of high school. So he was undervalued. So that gave TCU confidence in actually signing Hodges. And fast forward, he was one of their top tacklers in the season. Of course, TCU had a historic season, making the college playoffs and then competing in the national
the title
championship
game. Yeah, yeah.
And so it was actually well documented. They actually cited that player in the semifinals and talked about how TCU was the only Power 5 program that offered Hodges, and that was primarily as a result of data that supported what those coaches saw on film.
Yeah, and that's a great. I think I saw some tweets about that from your, from the Real Analytics account, and that's a great story. Kind of building on that, I did see you also recently tweet about some comments that I'm a Gator. I went to Florida, so I'm rooting for Rand Carthen. Love that he's now the GM of the Titans. And came from a very successful scouting department, at San Francisco. They've done a great job of identifying talent, especially I think later round talent.
Yes,
A
they
lot of
have.
their guys, and so he in his presser, when he got hired, he talked about, I think it was Elijah Mitchell was specifically the player, where one of his coaches or staff members came and said, "Hey, this guy can play." Or no, I think the staffer came with some data and said, "Hey, based on the numbers, this guy can play." They flipped on the tape. They said that matches the numbers. And this was a nice marriage of, the analytics kind of identifying a player and then the tape backing up what the analytics seem to say. Obviously, we know, I think Mitchell had maybe 1,000 yards or close to it as a rookie. He got injured last year, but that 6th-round pick or whatever, like that's already a win.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about it? I know you kind of already did, but this marriage between, or like, I guess maybe the question is, which comes first? Tape scouting, and I see this guy can play. Let me back it up with numbers. Or my personal process is a little bit more of, hey, the numbers filter out from thousands of potential players, a more select handful of guys I want to take a closer look at. Then the tape kind of backs up the numbers. Which way do you think, does it matter? Which way do you think is a better way to approach that?
That's a great question. And so from our perspective, first of all, we know that you can improve your hit rate when you combine both objective data and pair that with the eye test, right? Film. And so I know when we initially launched our company in 2020, there were a lot of questions from coaches about, well, hey, do your scores, does that replace us watching film? And how should we be thinking about that? It's like, no. You want to supplement your existing process by ingesting this data and incorporating this data into your process. So it's meant to enhance, it's meant to be used as a tool, and it's not the silver bullet that's going to answer all the questions, right? So to answer your question, I believe firmly that it can go either way. You can start with film and then have it supported with data, right? And that's where most of our clients do. So they've got a process whereby they go about identifying the talent. And then once they've identified the talent and kind of curated their prospect list down to a meaningful number of players, then that's when they bring us into the process to verify players that are on their board, right? And they're leveraging our data to help them differentiate between players that they may see very close on their board. And so,
Gotcha.
If they've got similarly graded players from a subjective standpoint, right, then they lean into our in-game athleticism score to better understand how they can differentiate between those similarly graded players. And so things like if they're evaluating a wide receiver and they have a similar grade on that wide receiver, depending on the scheme and what they're running, they may lean into our average yards of separation created metric and say, what, this particular prospect creates more separation than the other, and that can make the difference between moving up or down their board. And so we think it can go either way. I think the example that you cited from Rand was they started with the data, right? And then they used the film to confirm the data. And so that's perfectly fine as well. I think at the end of the day, the real win comes when you marry the two. And once if you marry the two, again, you're going to put yourself in a position to increase the chances of you hitting on that player.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. I think, I'm trying to put it in our context here for the official. What we're trying to do is find as many good prospects to put on fantasy football teams, college fantasy teams is kind of our angle.
Right.
And when we're diving as deep as we can, I mean, 4 stars and 5 stars are one thing, but we try to go as deep as possible because you never know when you're going to find the next Antonio Brown sitting way down and some 3-star out of Miami goes to Central Michigan and all of a sudden becomes, who he became. And so there's so many players, and of course we're doing this, as a very organized hobby, but still kind of a hobby. And so the time is of the essence. And so I try to use it like the numbers and some of these metrics to trim down 1,000 players
Yeah.
to 200 that I want to take a look at the most.
Right.
And then after that, some more. So that's kind of because we have to be more judicious. We're not full-time jobs, doing this all the time. So that's a little bit of the process, but I get it works either way. And I like that you're saying as long as you're doing both, you're gonna come out with a better, answer.
Yeah, and you said something that can really drive whether or not you lead with analytics or you use it to validate or verify. So our clients, so if you're dealing with thousands of kids, what a great way to filter down to a meaningful number, right? Is to use data to do that. It saves you time, right? Saves you, makes you more efficient, and you can go about it doing it that way. Most of our clients at the collegiate level use us on the back end. We have one client that uses us as a talent ID, but they feel most coaches are going to trust their eyes first.
Yeah, of course.
Right. And so, and we're okay with that. That doesn't offend us. So they want to trust their eyes first. They want to get their eyes on the player, watch his grind on the film, right? And then bring us in to verify certain things. They may look at a kid's tape, and like one of the biggest questions that they have is, how fast is this kid? Because I can't tell if he's fast or if the competition is slow, right?
100%.
And we're able to help answer that question, because if you're running 21 miles an hour, it doesn't matter if you're playing 7A ball in the state of Georgia or if you're playing 8-man football in Utah. 21 miles an hour is 21 miles an hour. And so that's where we, again, add a ton of value to our clients and helping them filter through and help answer some of those questions that these coaches may have on players.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, a little bit what we do. Our technology is not as fancy, but we try to do some of that here at the official at Campus to Canton. Speaking of which, quick plug here. So before we continue, just like and subscribe this video if you enjoy the conversation, if you enjoy what we're talking about with recruiting here on the official and having people like Cory Yates on for some really great insights. And then also check out the parent website, campuscanton.com. We have tools, we have rankings, we have everything you need to enjoy the college fantasy experience as well as into the NFL. So go check out that. We've got subscriptions starting as low as $2.99 a month. With that being said, I think this segues nicely into a question that we all have. And I think it's something that's come up with you. You've kind of flirted with it as well already. But when there is, say, your data, right, kind of going the opposite way, we're saying, film verifies this and the data then backs it up or whatever. But let's say the data is showing a hyper athletic player. You find some guy in middle of nowhere, Maryland, I don't know, and he's just a freak, absolute athletic freak. But for whatever reason, let's say he's a wide receiver. This comes into play in fantasy all the time. We find this guy, he's a freak, he's an athletic person, he should be dominating, but not getting the targets, not even the second on their team in targets, right? They're not getting used from our perspective as much as they should be. What kind of things that are we missing maybe, or you have even missed, where the athleticism is popping either with testing or even on field,
Right.
but the coaches, is it the coach's fault, or what other things about a player come into focus that they're just not commanding the volume or the usage or the touches that you'd think they would command with that athleticism? You ever run into that issue? And I'm sure it's varied, but just speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's funny that you mentioned that because there are instances where you can have a player that we grade out extremely high from an in-game athleticism standpoint, but yet the production is not there. So what do you do with that? We do look at and take into account production, so that we can get a sense for whether or not that athleticism is translating to the bottom line. I consider it the bottom line, right? Because at the end of the day, you can be uber athletic, but you have to be able to produce. And
Mhm.
so we do see instances where we have a player that is highly athletic, but perhaps the production is not there. That's when you have to peel the onion back. That's when you have to understand what scheme is he, especially when you're talking about high school players, right? What scheme is that player in, right? Um, you know, this kid could be a 6'4" receiver. He could run 21 miles an hour. He could create an average yards of separation of 3.5, 4 yards. All the things that we typically see in a high level / elite college prospect, but the production is not there, right? So if I just start with the numbers and I see that, and then I turn on the tape and they're running the triple option, I've answered my question.
Yeah.
And as an evaluator, I go, okay, I get it, right?
Hmm.
I get it. He's in a scheme that doesn't lend itself well to the attributes and the traits that this kid has to offer. So that's kind of point one. I think point two is really boils down to competition and the talent level that athlete is on. So again,
Hmm.
if you take a player that has really good scores, he tests well when he's on the summer camp circuit, right?
Hmm.
So he's got a
Hmm.
great 40 time, he's got a great vertical, broad jump, and all of that. Turn on the tape, and let's say it's a running back, and he can't get out of the backfield because his offensive line is not up to snuff.
Hmm.
Okay. What do you do with that? And so you have to take that into account, use that for context. And again, this is where I talked about earlier. You have to marry the data with the film, right?
Hmm.
Because without one or the other, you're gonna potentially miss on certain things, and you're not gonna have the proper context to be able to evaluate that player properly. So scheme fit, talent level, competition, those are some of the ancillary things that could impact a player's production. But we believe that you do have to account for player production when you're evaluating the player, not just the athleticism. We think about the athleticism as the ceiling, and we think
Right.
about production as the floor.
Okay.
And so that's how we think about it. And so when we sit down and we do our talent review meetings with some of our clients, we're doing a 2x2 matrix to understand the relationship between the ceiling and the floor, taking into account athleticism and production to understand, do we project them to be an immediate impact player, development player that may take 2 or 3 years to develop, um, but can this player go on to be eventually a starter for us, potentially all conference, all American? And in order to understand where those prospects fall in those quadrants, you kind of have to understand his upside from an athleticism standpoint and his production in terms of his floor.
Okay, I like that a lot. I really like thinking about athleticism as eventual upside if everything else comes together, and production. I like that a lot. That's really nice way to explain it. I think one guy who could be a story about this is Malik Benson, headed to Alabama. He's the guy, went JUCO, tore up JUCO, but we did a deep dive. Why did this guy go JUCO? He's extremely fast. I mean, I think over 21 miles an hour, maybe pushing 22. Looks like it on tape. But yeah, we went back and looked at his high school, and they were running like triple option. I think he had like 18. targets or something ridiculous in his senior year. Just they never threw the ball. He was playing somewhere in Kansas. They just ran triple option. Went JUCO, tore it up. Now got early commit to Alabama after his freshman year in JUCO. So obviously impressed some people. So we'll see what he does on the big stage next year in the SEC. Speaking of
Nice.
another, yeah, speaking of another receiver, and you can take this wherever you want, but Nathaniel Dell, who I know that Real Analytics has tweeted a little bit about him. His production score is off the charts. His athleticism is off the charts. His, I think, separation in man is kind of really, really good. Great feet and everything, but he's 5'8", 165.
Right.
So he's also going to be a little bit of an old rookie. He's a fifth-year senior. He's going to be 23, I believe, when he's drafted. But everyone's talking about him. He tore up the Senior Bowl. He was really good at the combine. He's a hot name right now, but that size is going to give people pause. And typically, what we do, we have our own set of analytics for fantasy purposes. And a guy that size usually doesn't command the type of targets that a fantasy wide receiver who's going to help your team win, commands.
Right.
So he's obviously very, very good. He's a good player. So how do you balance this idea of the prototype? He is not a prototype 5'8", 165. He's not 6 feet, 185 or 6'2", 220 like Julio, whatever. And then the compensatory factors like the fact that he's just really, really good and he's great at separation and all these other things. I mean, I think Dell is an interesting one this particular year where he checks a lot of boxes, but he's
Right.
not the prototype model. So what do you think about Dell? Have you talked to anybody about Dell through the process, any NFL teams or anything like that? And you can take this wherever you'd like to go.
Yeah, no. So I think he's going to be an interesting case study for this particular draft cycle. So I think you have to start with prototyping. That's my personal opinion. You start with prototyping, and then you work from there to understand if a player doesn't fit the prototype. How do you adjust? Right? Do you take them off your board? Do you keep them on your board? And then that's where your draft position kind of comes into play if we're talking NFL, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm drafting in the first round or two, then I'm definitely going to weigh prototyping a little bit heavier because I want to mitigate risk at those top rounds. It's all about mitigating risk. And then as you get later in the draft, then you have opportunity to take more risk, right? Because the internal expectations aren't as high on those later draft picks. But you want to do it wisely, right? You don't want to just throw darts in the dark. You want to do it wisely. And so that's where understanding the compensatory traits and factors come into play. And for us, we've been able to parse out what those compensatory factors are by studying successful players in the past that did not necessarily have the prototypical size or the prototypical speed. And that's where we kind of built our model to understand what traits are important, how much should we weigh them, so that when we are looking for somebody that is undersized, we understand what we should be looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we just stick with the wide receiver position, we stick to Tank Dell, what he does extremely well is create separation. So from our data, he falls in the 64th percentile in terms of average yards of separation created, which is pretty damn good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, he's not going to have the prototypical size. His change of direction almost in the 60th percentile, which is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's got some traits that when you don't have the prototypical size or speed, right? If you think about Cooper Kupp, he's not classified as a 4.3 guy, right?
No.
Good speed, don't get me wrong, good speed. But what our research showed was that Cooper Kupp created separation, and that's what made him special, right? That was his superpower. And
Mm-hmm.
so Tank Dell can create separation. He's one of the better ones in this particular draft class to be able to do that. He's highly productive when he was at University of Houston. Now, from a fantasy football standpoint, and I'm not the fantasy guru, but
Sure.
I would think that, to your point earlier, he target wise, he probably won't get a lot of targets, at the next level. Is he an NFL caliber receiver? Yeah, I think so. I think athletically, I think production wise, yes. I
Mhm.
think he'll probably be utilized and he'll need to make the 53-man roster at least on his first contract as a special teams player, right? And then if he flashes, you know, and is productive in the slot, you know what, then he can earn a little bit more targets, things of that nature. But I think, his first few years, he's going to have to make his mark on special teams. But I think he's got the traits to absolutely make a 53-man roster and worth taking in the later rounds. So that's kind of my personal take on Tate Dale. And then kind of how you balance prototyping versus weighing the compensatory factors and traits to understand what risk and mitigate your risk in taking a player. It's all about where you take them
Sure.
relative to the round you're selecting.
I think that's really great explanation. And one thing that I look at on this fantasy side, so we have the benefit usually when we're drafting our players, we know what their NFL draft capital is already. But one thing I do look at, and you just mentioned this, is especially for receivers who are taken in the day three. So, not first, not second, not third, but that whole big mix and match of the day three, or even undrafted free agents. I'm looking for special teams guys because, just like you said, they are not going to line up in the three deep, or the top three receivers out of camp. That's just not going to happen. But they need to stick around, like you said. They need to stick around and have opportunity to prove themselves even more. So I will look for guys who dominated on a special teams, and they may be drafted later. But I have done some research into this, and basically every receiver, I think it's almost every single guy. Maybe there's one that didn't, who became a fantasy relevant receiver, drafted it that late, contributed on special teams. It's almost like you have to, because
Right.
otherwise you're not going to get the opportunity if you're just an alpha X, but you draft in the sixth round. Like, you're just not. I mean, if you can't do it from day one, you're not going to even make the cut. So yeah, you have to contribute in multiple ways, and I think that's a good compensatory factor for us as fantasy people to look at those things. And obviously, you guys are looking at different stuff. Separation makes a lot of sense as well, and that's something that's you can measure it now, right?
Right.
But before that, that's probably there's a lot of nuance baked in there. Maybe you're not even the fastest athletically, but you have a good deception, which is sometimes like a pitcher. I always say it's like a pitcher who throws a good sequence of pitches. So maybe his pure talent isn't blowing people away with 100 miles an hour, but the way he pitches, he makes 100 miles an hour look like, or 95 look like 100, because of the way he sequences pitches, similar to maybe how a receiver may sequence moves and use deception, even if he doesn't have the pure unbridled athleticism.
So it's funny you say that because with Dale, so our data on Dale, he's not he doesn't have elite speed, believe it or
Hmm.
not, right? Looks fast on tape, but what he does have is elite acceleration and he has elite change of direction. And
Hmm.
so that's a great analogy that you use that I'd never really considered. But with Tank Dell, that's how he's able to create separation. So he's able to get on defensive backs' toes really quick, fast
Hmm.
and in a hurry, right? And then he's really good about sticking his foot in the ground and changing direction. And so when you can do those two things, when you can threaten the defensive back's cushion, and
Hmm.
you can run up on his toes quickly, that defensive back has got to respect the vertical. And so
Hmm.
he's going to open his hips up, right? And that's what's enabling Dale to create this separation, is that perception of,
Hmm.
holy cow, this kid's about to run past me,
Yeah.
right? But then he stops on a dime and he's in and out of his break, and he's got that separation that the
Yeah.
quarterback
3 to 5
is looking
yards
for.
on a curl or something. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, he's on it. And so when you think about some of the advanced scouting, just to kind of go back to that, what I mentioned earlier. So if we were playing University of Houston when Tank Dell was playing then last fall,
Hmm.
we would on the scouting report say, look, his top end speed is average.
Hmm.
Have your defensive backs sit on him.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So these are the nuances, right? That we have on these players to say, okay, don't worry about the vertical threat, right? Sit on them, understand where you're on the field in terms of spatial awareness. Understand if it's 3rd and 8, you want to settle down roughly around the sticks because the likelihood that he's going to run past you is probably slim to none.
Yeah. But then that DB still in the heat of the moment, he's got to remember that, right?
He's got to remember.
And
He's
when
got to
Dell gets
remember
on
that.
him, he's going to freak out.
He's got to
So,
remember that. And then depending on the defensive back speed, right? So if it's a cornerback that's uber fast, right? I'm telling my cornerback, look, he's not going to run past you. Even if you're late opening up, you're faster than him. And here's the data. You're two. I'm making it up. You're a mile and a half, 2 hours faster, miles per hour faster than this kid. Be patient in your pedal, right? Stay square as long as you can, right? And make sure you keep that separation to a minimum. And so those are the nuances that player tracking data can help with.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's excellent stuff. We're kind of getting on time. I had a few other questions. Maybe we'll just have to have you back later in the year or something like that. But one thing I did want to mention, if you're listening to this or watching this and you're not following Real Analytics or Cory himself, what is your handle, by the way? Is it at Cory Yates or?
Yeah, so my handle's on the screen. So it's Cory, RA Analytics. So
Okay.
You can find me there on Twitter.
Great. And then at Real Analytics, spelled like his shirt, I think REEL Analytics. But one thing I love you guys do, hashtag undercruited. I just wanted to mention that. Look for that. They dig these guys out. I mean, completely unknown, no offer type guys who then become relevant in this recruiting cycle. One guy you mentioned recently, I took a look at his tape, was Clayton Deese, a quarterback in Florida who looked very fun. And currently not getting any love. So, and they have a nice hit rate on some of these people. When you're talking about finding someone with no offers, if you're even probably hitting it 20%, who get a P5 offer or something, or even a G5 offer from nothing at this point, is a great hit rate. So, be looking for that. If you're listening to this, follow them on Twitter. Check that underrecruited hashtag. I look at it all the time, and I'd love to get you back maybe another time to talk about some of these really diamonds in the rough type players. That's it. Yeah, I mean, Cory, thanks so much. It's been really great to hear your process, and that helps us do our process and all of that. So thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
It's been really great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and so definitely check out Real Analytics, the website. Follow them on Twitter. They're always it's a great feed. They're always coming across my timeline as well. So thank you everyone for joining us on the official. Cory, have a great night. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Take care.
All right, bye.